At 11:23 in the morning on August 13, 1945, First Lieutenant Oscar Perdomo rolled his P-47 Thunderbolt into a hard-banking turn over the Korean countryside. 8,000 feet below him, 5 Japanese fighters broke formation. Perdomo leaned forward in his cockpit, eyes locked on the shapes twisting beneath the clouds. 26 years old, 9 combat missions, 0 victories. In the next 4 minutes, that would change forever. More than 50 Japanese aircraft had risen to challenge 38 American Thunderbolts in the skies above what would one day be known as Seoul. The Americans were outnumbered. They were nearly 750 miles from their base. And the war everyone believed would drag on for another year was only 48 hours away from ending. But nobody in those cockpits knew that yet. The atomic bombs had already fallen. Hiroshima on August 6th. Nagasaki on August 9th. Even now, at that exact moment, Emperor Hirohito was meeting with his war council in Tokyo, debating whether Japan should surrender. But over Korea the war still raged. Japanese pilots were still flying. American pilots were still hunting. And Oscar Perdomo was diving toward 3 enemy fighters with 8.50 caliber machine guns loaded and ready. Painted across the nose of his P-47 was a name that stood out against the olive drab metal: Lil Me's Meat Chopper. The artwork showed a cartoon baby wearing a derby hat, chomping on a cigar while clutching a rifle. It was a tribute to someone thousands of miles away. Perdomo's infant son, Kenneth, waiting back home in Los Angeles. The young pilot had no idea whether he would ever see that boy again. The mission they were flying that morning demanded almost 8 hours in the air and nearly 1,500 miles of flight. Most of it would be over open ocean, where a single engine failure meant certain death. The P-47 Thunderbolt had been built for missions exactly like this. Republic Aviation had redesigned the famous fighter specifically for the vast distances of the Pacific War. Massive new wings held extra fuel tanks, 93 gallons in each wing root. With external tanks attached, the aircraft could carry more than 200 gallons of fuel. It had the range to escort B-29 Super Fortress bombers all the way to Japan and back. And it had the firepower to destroy anything that crossed its path. 8 Browning, 50 caliber machine guns, 3,000 rounds of ammunition, a Pratt & Whitney radial engine producing nearly 2,800 horsepower, powerful enough to push the 7-ton fighter past 460 miles per hour. But all the range and firepower in the world meant nothing if you could not find the enemy. For 6 long weeks, the pilots of the 507th Fighter Group had flown mission after mission from their base on Ie Shima, a tiny island just 4 miles northwest of Okinawa. They escorted bombers. They strafed abandoned airfields. They burned fuel flying endless patrols over empty skies. The Japanese seemed to have vanished. Most American pilots believed the enemy was conserving its remaining aircraft for the massive Allied invasion of Japan everyone expected later that year. Some joked that the Japanese had simply run out of airplanes. August 13th proved otherwise. Mission 507-35 had launched 53 Thunderbolts at dawn. 15 turned back before reaching the target. Mechanical problems, navigation errors, engine trouble. Long-range missions pushed both men and machines to their limits. That left 38 fighters continuing northwest across the East China Sea. They crossed the Korean coastline shortly before noon. As the Thunderbolts approached the city of Kaizhou, modern-day Seoul, radar operators reported contacts. Not just a few, dozens. Japanese air units stationed across Korea had scrambled everything they had. Nakajima Ki, 84 Frank fighters. Nakajima Ki, 43 Oscar fighters. And even a pair of Yokosuka K-5Y Willow trainer biplanes that somehow found themselves climbing into the wrong sky at the wrong time. The Americans had finally found the enemy. Or rather, the enemy had found them. Perdomo selected his targets quickly. 3 trailing fighters flying at the rear of the Japanese formation. Standard combat tactics. Strike the last aircraft first. The leaders would not even realize they were under attack until their wingmen started burning. Perdomo pushed the throttle forward. The Thunderbolt surged with brutal acceleration. The distance between hunter and prey closed rapidly. 2,000 yards. 1,500. 1,000. At 800 yards, he centered the enemy fighter in his gun sight. Then he squeezed the trigger. 8 machine guns erupted in thunder. The war was about to end, and Oscar Perdomo was about to become the last American pilot in history to shoot down 5 enemy aircraft in a single day. The first burst struck the trailing P-84 exactly where he had aimed. The engine cowling. The cockpit. The Japanese fighter jerked violently. Black smoke exploded from the engine. Then the aircraft rolled into a tight spiral, plunging toward the Korean countryside far below. Perdomo didn't watch it crash. He had already shifted his gun sight to the next aircraft. 9 combat missions. Weeks of empty skies. Now that the enemy had finally appeared, Oscar Perdomo discovered something about himself. He was good at this. Very good. The P-84 Frank was the most advanced fighter Japan had fielded by the summer of 1945. Faster than the famous Zero. Better armed. Capable of climbing and maneuvering with many American aircraft that had dominated the Pacific skies for years. Japanese pilots called it, "Hey, the Gale." Allied intelligence considered it one of the few enemy fighters capable of matching American aircraft on equal terms. The pilots flying them over Korea that morning were among Japan's most experienced. None of that mattered once 8.50 caliber machine guns found their target. Perdomo's second opponent attempted to break right. Too late. The P-47N was not built for tight-turning fights. Fully loaded, it weighed nearly 20,000 pounds. It could not outturn a Japanese fighter. It could not outclimb one. But it could dive faster than almost anything in the sky. And when a Thunderbolt pilot attacked from above with surprise and speed, the mathematics of aerial combat became brutally simple. Speed. Firepower. Surprise. The second P-84 absorbed a devastating burst across its fuselage. Perdomo saw pieces tearing away from the aircraft. A section of wing. Fragments of the tail. Then flames erupted from the fuel tanks. The fighter became a tumbling fireball dropping toward the earth. 2 kills. Less than 60 seconds. The third Japanese pilot had seen enough. He rolled inverted and dove for the deck, accelerating away from the American fighter that had just destroyed his wingmen. Perdomo let him go. The Thunderbolt had the speed to chase. But chasing a single fleeing enemy meant losing track of the larger battle raging around him. Somewhere above Korea, 37 other American pilots were fighting more than 50 Japanese aircraft. Perdomo needed to find his squadron. He pulled the Thunderbolt into a climbing turn and scanned the sky. Aircraft twisted and dove everywhere. Smoke trails marked damaged machines. At least 3 parachutes floated below, though he could not tell whether they carried American or Japanese pilots. Then he glanced at his fuel gauge. The mission clock kept ticking. 8 hours of flight. Every minute of combat burned fuel 3 times faster than cruise power. The external tanks had already been dropped before the fight began. Now he was running on internal fuel only, and the flight back to Ieshima would take nearly 4 hours. The math was simple and unforgiving. Then he spotted something unexpected below. 2 aircraft flying together at low altitude. Perdomo blinked in disbelief. They were not fighters. They were biplanes. Yokosuka K-5Y Willow trainers, slow, canvas-covered relics from an earlier era of aviation. What they were doing in the middle of an air battle made absolutely no sense. But they carried Japanese markings, which meant they were legitimate targets. Perdomo rolled the Thunderbolt inverted and dove. The biplanes spotted him instantly. They split apart, each pilot choosing a different direction. Perdomo selected the closest one. The Willow had a maximum speed of 132 miles per hour. The P-47N was diving at over 400. The engagement lasted perhaps 3 seconds. The machine guns roared. The biplane erupted in flames. It spiraled downward and smashed into the Korean countryside in a column of black smoke. Perdomo's third victory. He searched briefly for the second Willow, but it had vanished into the terrain below. When he climbed back toward the clouds, he glanced at his ammunition counters. The numbers were falling faster than he liked. 3 kills had already consumed nearly half his rounds. Lil Me's meat chopper still had teeth, but they were getting shorter. Perdomo pushed the Thunderbolt upward through the clouds, searching for friendly aircraft. Instead, he found 4 Japanese fighters waiting for him. For P-84 Franks held the altitude advantage. They had spotted the American climbing through the cloud layer. They had positioned themselves perfectly. Sun behind them. Speed building. The classic bounce attack that had killed hundreds of Allied pilots across the Pacific. Perdomo saw them at the last possible moment. Four dark shapes diving out of the glare, closing fast. He had maybe 2 seconds to react. 2 seconds to decide whether his son Kenneth would ever see his father again. And Perdomo made a decision. He did not run. The P-47 Thunderbolt was famous for its durability. It could absorb punishment that would tear other fighters apart, but not from 4 enemy aircraft firing at once. Perdomo understood that instantly. Instead of diving away or braking hard for the clouds, he did something that went against every instinct a fighter pilot possessed. He turned directly into the attack. The maneuver stunned the Japanese pilots. They had expected the American to run. Instead, the Thunderbolt was climbing toward them, nose pointed straight into their formation, speed bleeding away as gravity fought against the engine. For a fraction of a second, the 4 Ki-84 pilots hesitated. They had to adjust their aim. That tiny hesitation was all Perdomo needed. He rolled the Thunderbolt upside down and pulled hard on the stick, snapping the aircraft through a brutal reversal. The maneuver carried him beneath the diving Japanese fighters just as their speed carried them past him. In a single instant, the geometry of the fight changed. The hunters had just become the targets. Perdomo selected the last aircraft in the formation. He squeezed the trigger. 8 Browning machine guns erupted again. The Ki-84 pilot never saw the tracers coming. The .50 caliber rounds slammed into the engine, cowling, and cockpit almost simultaneously. The Japanese fighter exploded in a violent flash of orange fire. Pieces of wing tore away. The aircraft tumbled downward in flames. For kills. In less than 5 minutes of combat, Oscar Perdomo had just become an ace. Not after months of combat. Not after dozens of missions. In a single engagement, the remaining 3 Japanese fighters scattered. One dove toward the ground. Another climbed sharply toward the clouds. The third began circling, trying to set up another attack. Perdomo ignored them. He glanced at his ammunition counters. The numbers made his stomach tighten. He had perhaps 30 seconds of firing time left. Maybe less. He needed to find his squadron, and he needed to start the long flight home. The sky over Korea had dissolved into chaos. Smoke columns rose from at least a dozen crash sites scattered across the countryside below. Aircraft twisted through every altitude band. Some pilots still fought desperately. Others simply tried to escape the swirling violence. Then Perdomo spotted something familiar. 2 P-47 Thunderbolts flying close together at roughly 3,000 feet. The wide paddle blade propellers glinted in the sunlight. Friendly aircraft. He banked toward them, and immediately saw the problem. A single Ki-84 Frank had locked itself onto the tail of one Thunderbolt and refused to let go. The American pilot was jinking violently, weaving left and right, trying to throw off the attacker. The Japanese fighter matched every move. The second Thunderbolt was trying to help, but the angles were terrible. Every time the wingman lined up a shot, his squadron mate drifted directly into the line of fire. One wrong burst could destroy a friendly aircraft. Perdomo shoved the throttle forward and dove toward the fight. Lil Me's meat chopper had maybe 20 seconds of ammunition left. He would have to make it count. He approached from above and behind. The same attack profile that had already worked 4 times that morning. The Ki-84 pilot never saw him coming. The Japanese pilot was completely focused on the Thunderbolt filling his gun sight in front of him. Waiting, timing his shot, preparing to fire. He never checked his 6 o'clock. He never saw the American fighter diving toward him at nearly 400 miles per hour. Perdomo pressed the trigger. The Thunderbolt's guns roared. Tracers stretched across the sky toward the Japanese aircraft. Hits sparkled along the fuselage. The Ki-84 jerked violently. Smoke erupted from the engine. Then, silence. Not a gradual slowdown. Not a few final rounds. Just complete silence. All 8 machine guns had run dry at exactly the same moment. 3,000 rounds of ammunition, enough firepower to tear apart a building, had been expended in less than 6 minutes of combat. The Ki-84 was damaged, but it was still flying. Smoke trailed behind it, but the aircraft remained under control. The Japanese pilot suddenly realized he was under attack from a second direction. He broke away from the American Thunderbolt he had been chasing. Then he turned toward Perdomo. Oscar Perdomo was now 750 miles from home, alone in hostile airspace. His ammunition was gone. His guns were empty. And a damaged, but still dangerous, enemy fighter was turning to kill him. Most pilots would have run. The logic was obvious. Dive for the deck. Use the Thunderbolt speed. Put distance between yourself and the enemy. Return to base. Live to fight another day. Oscar Perdomo did not run. The P-84 finished its turn and pointed directly at the American fighter. From the Japanese pilot's perspective, this was simple. Another American needed to be destroyed. He had guns. The enemy did not appear to be retreating. The attack would be quick. Perdomo watched the Japanese fighter steady its nose. Smoke still streamed from the engine. But the aircraft was coming, and its guns were still very much alive. Perdomo turned directly toward him. The maneuver made absolutely no sense. An unarmed fighter charging a fully armed enemy violated every principle of aerial combat. But Perdomo understood something the mathematics of the situation could not measure. The Japanese pilot did not know his guns were empty. All he could see was an American Thunderbolt coming straight at him. Nose to nose. Closing speed nearly 800 miles per hour. It was the deadliest game in the sky. Aerial chicken. The P-84 pilot blinked first. With his own engine trailing smoke and a seemingly armed American charging straight at him, he broke sharply to the right. He abandoned the attack. Perdomo followed immediately. He turned inside the Japanese fighter, keeping his nose pointed toward the enemy, maintaining the illusion that he was still hunting. Every second the Japanese pilot remained defensive was another second of survival. Perdomo grabbed his radio. Bandit engaged, need assistance. Somewhere above the chaos of the battle, another Thunderbolt pilot heard the call. An American was in trouble, and help came fast. Perdomo continued the deadly dance. Turn, counter-turn, dive, climb. Again and again, he pointed his empty guns at the Japanese fighter, forcing the pilot to react defensively. But the bluff could not last forever. Eventually, the enemy pilot would notice something strange. No tracers, no gunfire, nothing but an American fighter pretending to shoot. Eventually, he would realize the truth. The help arrived first. A second P-47 dropped out of the clouds at full power. The pilot had read the situation instantly. He positioned his aircraft perfectly for a clean firing pass. The P-84 pilot never saw him. All his attention remained locked on the Thunderbolt chasing him. 8.50 caliber machine guns opened fire. The Japanese fighter disintegrated under the impact. Wings tore away. The engine separated from the fuselage. Flaming wreckage scattered across the Korean sky. 5 kills. In a single morning. Oscar Perdomo had just accomplished something fewer than 100 American pilots achieved during the entire Second World War. He had become an ace in one day, and history would remember him as the last American pilot ever to do it. But Perdomo's war was not over yet. He was still 750 miles from home. His fuel gauges were already demanding attention, and the sky over Korea still held enemy aircraft who wanted him dead. The battle was finished, but the most dangerous part of the mission was only beginning. The flight home. The Thunderbolts settled into formation at 12,000 feet. It was the altitude Pacific pilots preferred on the return leg of a long mission, high enough that a pilot with engine trouble might still have some chance to glide toward land, low enough to conserve fuel in an aircraft that had already spent too much of it in combat. The radio stayed mostly quiet. There was very little left to say. Each pilot watched his instruments, checked his gauges, counted the minutes, and listened to the steady rhythm of an engine that had to keep running for hundreds more miles over open water. Below them, the East China Sea stretched in every direction, a vast sheet of gray-blue emptiness broken only by the occasional cloud shadow. August heat rising off the water created thermals that jostled the heavy fighters unpredictably. Perdomo trimmed Lil Me's meat chopper carefully for maximum efficiency, adjusting throttle and fuel mixture to squeeze every possible mile from what remained in his tanks. The autopilot helped hold course. For the first time since the fight began, he was able to loosen his grip on the controls. And think, 5 kills. The number felt absurd. For 9 missions, he had seen almost nothing. Empty skies, long escorts, distant targets, and endless ocean. Then, in less than 6 minutes, the entire shape of his war had changed. He could still see it. The tracers reaching outward from 8 machine guns. The first Japanese fighter twisting into a fatal spiral. The second bursting apart. The little biplane trainer catching fire and tumbling out of the sky. The 4 Franks diving from the sun. The impossible decision to turn into them instead of away. He had no way of knowing yet whether the official record would confirm all 5 victories. But he knew what he had seen, and the gun camera had seen it too. Film did not exaggerate. Film did not forget. The intelligence officers would review it frame by frame, measuring every burst, every hit, every falling aircraft. That process might take hours, perhaps days. Until then, Perdomo's kills were still only claims. Every pilot made claims. Not every pilot could prove them. 2 hours into the return flight, the formation crossed the invisible line where open ocean began to feel less like enemy territory and more like home. Okinawa appeared first as a dark smudge on the horizon. Just beyond it lay Ie Shima, the small coral island that had become home to fighter groups, bombers, mechanics, supply crews, and thousands of men moving war forward one mission at a time. The island carried its own ghosts. For months earlier, Ernie Pyle, the most famous war correspondent in America, had been killed there by Japanese machine gun fire during the invasion. His death had rippled through the armed forces like a personal loss. Now the same island served as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, launching strikes against the Japanese homeland almost every day. Perdomo glanced down at his fuel gauges. The needles were sinking toward empty. Other pilots reported the same problem over the radio. The mission had pushed the P-47N to the very edge of its design envelope. Another 50 miles of ocean might have meant dead engines, ditching aircraft, and pilots floating helplessly in the East China Sea. But the island kept growing in the windscreen. That was enough. The Thunderbolts dropped into the landing pattern one by one. Wheels down. Flaps extended. Final approach over the beach where Pyle had died. Perdomo brought the fighter in carefully and felt the aircraft settle onto the coral runway. The wheels touched. The tail came down. And at last the mission was over. 8 hours and 18 minutes after takeoff, mission 507-35 was complete. He taxied toward the hard stand where his crew chief was already waiting. The mechanic's eyes went straight to the gun ports. Carbon staining. Burn residue. The marks of sustained firing. Then he looked up at Perdomo's face and understood immediately that something unusual had happened. The debriefing room filled quickly. Pilots still wore sweat-soaked flight suits. The smell of aviation fuel, hot oil, and gunpowder clung to them as intelligence officers moved from man to man collecting reports, matching times, positions, and enemy aircraft descriptions. The first total sounded almost unbelievable. 20 Japanese aircraft destroyed. No American fighters lost. The sort of exchange rate commanders dreamed about, but rarely saw. Perdomo sat in a folding chair and told his story as plainly as he could. 5 enemy aircraft, 4 fighters and 1 trainer. The intelligence officer wrote it all down. Initial claims would be filed at once. Final confirmation would wait for the film. The 507th Fighter Group had only entered combat on July 1, 1945. For 6 weeks they had flown patrols, escort missions, and ground attacks with almost no aerial opposition. The Japanese had been holding their aircraft back, preserving them for the invasion everyone expected would come. Then August 13th happened. The group had stumbled into the largest concentration of enemy fighters it would ever see. The result was one of the most one-sided American fighter victories of the final month of the war. But even as the pilots on Ie Shima tried to absorb what had happened, events far larger than any dogfight were already overtaking them. In Tokyo, the emperor had made his decision. Japan would surrender. The invasion would never take place. The millions of casualties that planners on both sides had quietly accepted as inevitable would never happen. The pilots on Ie Shima did not know any of that yet. To them, August 13th was simply another day of war, a day that had ended very differently from what anyone expected. That evening, technicians threaded the gun camera film through projectors and watched the combat unfold. Frame by frame, there was no ambiguity in the first 4 kills. The film showed the first key, 84 taking hits, catching fire, and spiraling downward. The second fighter coming apart under concentrated fire. The bizarre Willow trainer burning against the Korean landscape. And the 4th kill, the ambusher that became the ambushed after Perdomo's reversal. The 5th victory created debate. The film clearly showed Perdomo's guns running dry during the attack. It showed the Japanese fighter damaged and smoking. It showed him chase that armed aircraft with empty guns, bluffing and maneuvering until another Thunderbolt arrived to finish the job. By strict procedure, The final destruction had been caused by someone else's gunfire. Under that interpretation, the fifth kill should have gone to the other pilot. But combat was not always so tidy. Without Perdomo's attack, the Japanese fighter would have destroyed the American Thunderbolt it was pursuing. Without Perdomo's pursuit, the damaged fighter would have escaped. Without Perdomo's willingness to chase an armed enemy while completely unarmed, the final engagement would never have developed. The officers studying the film reached the conclusion that mattered most. The fifth aircraft was his. It had been a team effort, but Oscar Perdomo had made it possible. So the official record stood. 5 confirmed victories in one day. Ace in a day. The designation placed him in remarkably exclusive company. Fewer than 50 American pilots in the entire war had achieved it. Men like Chuck Yeager in Europe and Pappy Boyington in the Pacific had entered that category. Now so had Perdomo. And because of the date, his achievement carried a final distinction no one yet fully appreciated. He would become the last American pilot ever to earn Ace-in-a-Day status in combat. The next morning, August 14th, the 507th began preparing for another mission. Crew chiefs rearmed aircraft. Pilots reviewed briefings. Fuel trucks rolled across the field. No one had told them the war was ending. Then the radios crackled with the news. The Emperor had accepted surrender. Japan was finished. The war was over. Oscar Perdomo would never fly another combat mission. His 5 victories from August 13th would stand forever as the final ace-in-a-day achievement in United States military history. The guns had fallen silent just in time, and Lil Me's meat chopper had earned its name on the very last day it could. For months after the war ended, the 507th Fighter Group was deactivated. The mission over Korea on August 13th, 1945 had been one of its final combat operations. The aircraft were reassigned. Pilots returned home. The massive war machine that had mobilized millions of men across the globe slowly began shutting down. For Oscar Perdomo, however, flying did not end when the war did. He remained in the Army Air Forces, one of the relatively small number of wartime pilots retained for peacetime service. Aviation was changing rapidly, and experienced combat pilots were suddenly among the most valuable instructors in the military. Then, in 1947, the United States Air Force became an independent branch of the armed forces. Perdomo transferred into the new service. The aircraft he flew now were different. Jets had begun replacing propeller-driven fighters. The sleek new machines were faster, louder, and more powerful than anything that had existed during the war. But the fundamentals of flying remained the same. Stick and rudder, eyes outside the cockpit, and the instincts that had kept him alive over Korea. In January 1950, Perdomo left active duty and returned to civilian life in Los Angeles. His son Kenneth was now 5 years old, no longer the diapered baby painted on the nose of Lil Me's meat chopper. The war was over, and Perdomo seemed ready to begin the life that millions of returning veterans were trying to build. He joined the Air Force Reserve, continuing to fly while building a future outside the military. For a few months, it seemed as though the transition had worked. Then history intervened again. In June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. 5 years after Perdomo had shot down 5 aircraft over the Korean peninsula, war returned to the exact same territory. The United States mobilized quickly. Reserve units were activated. Experienced pilots were recalled to duty. Nearly 40,000 Americans would die in the Korean War. Among the pilots returning to service was Captain Oscar Perdomo. He reported back for active duty on June 30, 1950. The Air Force needed men who understood combat. The man who had become the last ace-in-a-day over Korea was going back to the same skies. This time he flew jets, F-84 Thunderjets. Later, the famous F-86 Sabre. The aircraft looked nothing like the heavy Thunderbolt he had flown in 1945. The propeller had been replaced by a jet engine, the cockpit filled with new instruments, and speeds had nearly doubled. But the pilot inside remained the same. Calm, methodical, focused. Perdomo spent much of the war flying training and qualification missions, helping prepare the next generation of pilots for combat against Soviet-built MiG fighters over the Yalu River. His aircraft carried no nose art now. There were no babies smoking cigars painted beneath the cockpit. Kenneth was a teenager by then, too old for that kind of symbol. In February 1955, Perdomo proved that the instincts that had saved him in combat still guided him. He was flying a T-34 F-33 trainer with a student in the rear seat when the aircraft developed a severe fuel leak. Gasoline fumes quickly filled the cockpit. The fumes burned his eyes. Visibility dropped. The smell of fuel meant the aircraft could ignite at any moment. Most pilots would have ejected immediately, abandoning the aircraft. Perdomo stayed with the plane. He shut down the engine and executed a dead-stick landing, guiding the powerless aircraft back to the runway and bringing both himself and his students safely to the ground. Even in peacetime, the same calm decisions that had once saved his life now saved others. He retired from the Air Force in January 1958. Rank, Major. 20 years of service. 2 wars. 5 kills in a single day. A career most pilots could only imagine. The man who had once charged Japanese fighters with empty guns finally stopped flying. Oscar Perdomo settled into civilian life in Los Angeles. He had survived 2 wars. He had achieved something that would likely never happen again. He had a wife, a home, and children who knew their father not as a wartime legend, but simply as a father. For many years, life remained quiet. The war became memories shared at veterans' gatherings. Stories told to friends. Stories told to young pilots who wanted to know what the skies had been like during the final days of World War II. But history was not finished with the Perdomo family. Vietnam took his son. Specialist 4th Class Chris Mitchell Perdomo served as a door gunner aboard a UH-1 Huey helicopter. The same boy whose infant face had once been painted on the nose of Lil Me's meat chopper had grown into a young man flying into combat, just as his father had done. 25 years later, on May 5, 1970, his helicopter crashed and exploded 5 miles southwest of Phu Yen in South Vietnam. Chris Mitchell Perdomo was one of 3 crew members killed. The loss devastated Oscar Perdomo. He had survived Japanese fighters. He had survived empty guns and 8-hour missions over the Pacific. He had survived 2 wars that killed millions. But he could not survive the loss of his son. The man who had once faced death calmly in the sky struggled to face life afterward. Alcohol slowly consumed him. Major Oscar Francis Perdomo died on March 2, 1976, in Los Angeles. He was 56 years old. His family honored his final wish. His ashes were scattered over the Pacific Ocean, the same vast waters he had crossed so many times during the war. The last ace in a day returned to the sky one final time. His achievement remains unique. Many jet pilots have claimed 5 kills in a single day, but none have been confirmed with the same certainty that gun camera footage provided in 1945. Oscar Perdomo remains the last undisputed ace in a day in United States history. The record has stood for nearly 80 years. It may stand forever. Today, the commemorative Air Force maintains a flying P-47 Thunderbolt painted to resemble Lil Me's meat chopper. The same baby with the cigar. The same derby hat. The same aircraft that once carried a young pilot into one of the final dogfights of World War II. The aircraft appears at air shows across the country, telling a story most people have never heard. Perdomo's name is engraved at the United States Air Force Memorial in Washington. His personal papers are preserved in the archives of the San Diego Air and Space Museum, and his Distinguished Service Cross citation remains part of the official record, documenting heroism that no bureaucratic language could ever fully capture. August 13, 1945, 48 hours before the end of the deadliest war in human history. 38 American Thunderbolts against more than 50 Japanese fighters over Korea. One pilot from East Los Angeles, the son of a Mexican immigrant who once rode with Pancho Villa, flying an aircraft named after his infant son. 5 victories. 0 ammunition remaining. 750 miles from home. That morning, Lil Me's meat chopper earned its name, and Oscar Perdomo earned his place in history.